The Turners' backyard seemed bigger under the starlight. The freshly cut grass spread its scent through the warm summer air, and small fireflies blinked along the fence edges, creating a natural spectacle that mesmerized Jessica and Howard. The two children, only 8 years old, ran across the lawn, laughing as they invented fantastic adventures. "This castle is mine," Howard shouted, piling stones and pieces of wood in a corner of the yard. "And I am the king. King of a crooked castle," Jessica replied, laughing and gently kicking a piece of wood to dismantle the makeshift construction. Howard made a face but soon laughed as well. No matter what they did, they always found a way to have fun together. Howard loved Jessica's way, how she always seemed to have a ready answer, a crazy idea, or a laugh that made everything better. Inside the house, the voices of the adults echoed through the dining room. Howard's parents were visiting the Turners for one last meeting before the big move. Howard's father's job required the family to relocate to a larger city, something he and his wife weren't particularly thrilled to explain to the children. "Howard will miss Jessica as much as she will miss him," said Howard's mother with a sigh. "They're like two magnets." "That's true," Jessica's mother replied. "But kids adapt. Who knows, maybe one day they'll meet again." Outside, Jess and Howard lay on the grass, exhausted from their games. They stared at the starry sky in silence, catching their breath. "Do you think the stars know everything?" Jessica asked, breaking the silence. Howard turned his head to her, frowning. "Everything what?" "Everything, like who we'll be when we grow up. Or if we'll do something important." He pondered for a moment before answering. "I think so. The stars see everything. Maybe they even help." Jessica smiled. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Howard shrugged, looking back at the sky. "I don't know. I think I want to do something big. Like, build something people will remember. Something important." "Like a rocket?" Jessica asked, laughing. "Maybe," Howard said, smiling back. "And you?" Jessica was silent for a moment, seriously thinking about the question. "I think I just want to be happy," she finally replied. Howard turned to her, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "I promise you will be," he said, with the disarming sincerity that only a child could have. Before Jessica could respond, Howard's mother's voice cut through the moment. "Howard, time to go." He stood up slowly, reluctant to leave the yard and his best friend. Turning to her, he said, "Are we having dinner here again next week?" Jessica hesitated before answering. "Are you really moving?" Howard looked down, lightly kicking the grass. "My dad said so. But I'll come back. I promise." As he started walking toward the house, Jessica ran after him. "Howard," she shouted. "Do you really promise?" He turned and smiled. "I promise." As he got into the car and the doors closed, something magical happened. A shooting star streaked across the sky, quick and bright. "Howard! Look!" Jessica shouted, pointing. "Make a wish." Jessica squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the gate tightly. "I wish Howard would come back to me one day," she thought, with all the seriousness an 8-year-old could muster. Inside the car, Howard saw the same star. He whispered to himself, "I wish I could see Jessica again one day." Both remained silent after that, each lost in their own small world of hopes and dreams. Jessica stayed at the gate, watching the car's taillights disappear around the corner. She felt a void in her chest but held on to Howard's promise as a little treasure. Inside the car, Howard held onto a rocket keychain he always carried. He didn't know if stars really granted wishes, but he decided to believe. After all, there was something comforting about the idea that the universe could listen. And so, under the same starry sky, two children separated by fate made promises that would shape their lives in ways they could not yet imagine. The years after Howard's departure were lonely for Jessica. For a while, she still hoped to hear from him, imagining that a letter, a phone call, or even an unexpected visit might fill the void he had left behind. But, as happens with so many childhood promises, life moved in opposite directions. Jessica grew up in Maplewood, a small and quiet town where everyone seemed to know everything about everyone. During high school, she excelled as a brilliant student, particularly in science. Her insatiable curiosity and unwavering determination were often attributed to her childhood friendship with Howard. He had always challenged her to think big, even when they were just kids. However, his absence was a constant shadow. As she grew older, Jess began to realize that Maplewood was too small a place for her ambitions. Despite her love for her family and friends, she knew she needed to leave to truly find her potential. In her final year of high school, Jessica received the news that would change her life: a full scholarship to study physics at a prestigious university in another state. It was a moment of celebration, but also of farewells. Her mother hugged her with tears in her eyes, both proud and reluctant to see her go. "You've always been my little explorer," her mother said with a melancholic smile. "Go chase your dream, but never forget where you came from." Jessica promised she wouldn't. However, as she packed her bags and said goodbye to Maplewood, something else weighed on her mind. She took one last look at the starry sky from the backyard where she had so often played with Howard and felt a pang of longing. Even after so many years, the memory of their childhood promise remained alive. University was a shock. The campus was large, diverse, and challenging. Jessica threw herself into her studies, determined to make the most of the opportunities she had earned. Her theoretical physics classes were difficult but fascinating, and she quickly stood out as one of the top students in her program. Outside the classroom, however, life was complicated. Jess struggled to find her place. Her peers often saw her as distant or even arrogant, not understanding that she was simply focused on achieving her goals. Relationships came and went, but none of them felt right. Deep down, she knew she still carried the marks of her childhood promise. In her second year at university, Jessica received devastating news. Her father had suffered a heart attack and passed away suddenly. She returned to Maplewood for the funeral, where she found her mother visibly shaken but trying to be strong. "He was so proud of you," her mother said, holding Jessica's hand as they stood by the coffin. "He always said you'd reach for the stars." Her father's loss shook Jessica deeply, but it also reinforced her determination. Back at university, she channeled her grief into her studies. Every formula learned, every problem solved, felt like a way to honor her father's memory and the promise she had made to herself to achieve something greater. While Jessica fought for her place in the world, Howard followed an equally challenging path. After moving, his family faced financial difficulties, and he learned early the value of hard work. Despite the hardships, Howard demonstrated an impressive aptitude for math and engineering. In high school, he excelled in science competitions and was accepted into MIT, where he quickly became a standout among future aerospace engineers. Yet, he too felt the weight of loneliness. The memory of Jessica lingered, even as he tried to ignore it. Howard built an impressive career after graduation, working on cutting-edge space exploration projects. However, every time he looked up at the starry sky, he wondered where Jessica was and whether she still remembered the promise they had made. By the end of graduate school, Jessica was accepted into a program at the space agency, where she finally began to see her dreams come to fruition. But even as her career soared, she couldn't avoid feeling empty during quiet moments. Nights were the worst, when she looked at the stars and wondered why something seemed to be missing. During a visit back to Maplewood, she sat in her childhood backyard, now a bit more neglected. The sky was just as starry as she remembered, and for a moment, she allowed herself to think of Howard. Did he still remember her? Had their childhood promise meant anything to him, or was it just a distant memory? Jessica didn't know, but the universe had plans to reunite them in a way even the stars couldn't predict. The main lab at the space agency was bustling with activity. Jessica, now 33 years old, walked down the brightly lit hallway with purposeful strides, holding a tablet full of notes. There was an energy in the air she hadn't felt in a long time. The new Mars exploration project, one of the agency's largest endeavors, was not only an opportunity for her career but also a dream she had nurtured since her university days. She entered the conference room with her usual focus. The room was full of engineers and scientists, each immersed in their own materials. The space was familiar, with tables equipped with holographic screens and 3D projections displaying the spacecraft that would be at the heart of the mission. But one face, at the back of the room, caught her attention. He was leaning against the table, analyzing a propulsion model. Tall, with slightly disheveled hair and an expression that mixed concentration and ease, he seemed perfectly at home. Jessica didn't immediately recognize the man, but something about his posture and subtle smile evoked a curious sense of déjà vu. "Team," began Dr. Collier, the project leader, calling everyone's attention. "Today we have the pleasure of introducing a new team member. This is Howard Bennett, our test pilot and aerospace engineer. He will be instrumental in ensuring our systems are ready for the real challenges of the mission." Howard looked up and smiled at the group, his features relaxed but full of conviction. "It's an honor to work with all of you," he said, his voice firm and warm. "This project is a unique opportunity, and I'm excited to contribute." Jessica paid attention but without much thought. The name sounded familiar, but she attributed it to fatigue or some other coincidence. During the rest of the meeting, she remained focused on the presentations and technical specifications, trying to ignore the slight unease his presence stirred. After the meeting, Howard approached her as the others left the room. "Dr. Turner," he said, extending a hand with a smile. "Looks like we'll be teammates." Jessica shook his hand, responding with a polite smile. "Welcome. I hope you're ready to work hard. This mission isn't for the faint of heart." Howard chuckled softly. "I can assure you, I'm used to challenges." She nodded, but the unease lingered. It was a feeling of familiarity she couldn't place. However, it wasn't uncommon to meet people she might have crossed paths with at some point in her career. Jessica brushed the thought aside and returned to work. In the following days, Howard and Jessica worked together on various simulations and technical meetings. He was competent and composed, but there was something about his observations that left her unsettled. Small details began to emerge, the way he furrowed his brow when concentrating or how his laugh seemed to evoke a forgotten memory. During a break, while discussing adjustments to one of the spacecraft models, Howard casually mentioned, "Did you know I grew up in a small town called Maplewood?" Jessica froze, feeling a wave of shock. "Maplewood?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I grew up there." Howard stopped what he was doing and looked at her with a spark in his eyes. "Jessica Turner?" he asked slowly, as if testing the words. Her heart raced. "Yes." "How do you know that?" He broke into a smile, now more confident. "I knew you seemed familiar." "It's me, Howard Bennett." "Howard, from kindergarten." Jessica blinked, confused, as memories flooded her mind. The promise, the shooting star, the backyard. It was him. After more than 2 decades, fate had brought them together. "I can't believe it," she said, finally finding her voice. "It's really you, Howard?" He laughed, shaking his head. "It's me. You have no idea how many times I wondered if I'd ever see you again." They stood in silence for a moment, both absorbing the reunion. Finally, Jessica smiled, an odd yet familiar emotion filling her chest. "Well, I guess we have a lot to catch up on." "Definitely," he replied, with a smile that seemed to hold decades of stories. The days following their reunion were marked by a mix of surprise and nostalgia for Jessica and Howard. While work on the mission demanded focus and dedication, there was something else now lingering between them, an old connection they were beginning to rediscover. Jessica maintained her professional demeanor, but it was impossible to ignore Howard's presence. He seemed so at ease in the lab, walking among the models and simulations with a confidence she admired. Yet, there was something subtler, the way he looked at her, as if trying to bring back memories from another life. One afternoon, while they were adjusting the settings on one of the propulsion systems, Howard broke the silence with a smile. "Do you remember when we tried to build a rocket in your backyard?" Jessica looked up, surprised. "Oh my God, I had forgotten about that." That rocket exploded and almost set the fence on fire. And you blamed me, Howard replied, laughing. Although, to be fair, it was my idea. Of course it was, she said, laughing for the first time in a long while. But I wasn't going to take the blame alone. Howard seemed satisfied to see her relax, even if only for a moment. There was something comforting about their exchange, something that seemed to transcend time. No matter how hard they tried to focus on work, nostalgia always found a way to surface. Over time, the barriers began to come down. During breaks, Jessica and Howard started talking more openly. He told her about his childhood after leaving Maplewood, the financial struggles his family faced, and how he found purpose in aerospace engineering. She, in turn, shared about losing her father and how that had shaped her determination to achieve something meaningful in life. One evening, as they worked late on a simulation, Howard casually remarked, "My dad used to say that hard work defines us." I think, in a way, he was right. But sometimes I wonder if what we're doing is enough. Jessica looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. My dad said something similar. He always talked about how I would reach the stars. When I started working here, it felt like I was honoring his memory. Howard nodded, his eyes fixed on the holographic model before them. I think he'd be very proud of you. I know I am. Jessica averted her gaze, trying to process what she felt. Howard's sincerity touched her in ways she hadn't expected. Even after all these years, he seemed to be the same person who had held her hand in the backyard, promising to return. As the connection between them grew, so did the challenges of the project. During a critical simulation, an unexpected propulsion system failure caused a controlled explosion. The lab fell silent as the team tried to process what had happened. Jessica immediately took charge. We need to review the entire model, she said, her voice firm. We can't risk something like this happening on the real mission. Howard noticed the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Later, he found her alone in the lab, reviewing the data. He entered quietly, placing a cup of coffee beside her. You're being too hard on yourself, he said gently. These problems are part of the process. Jessica sighed, not taking her eyes off the screen. Maybe. But if we make a mistake in space, there won't be a second chance. Howard leaned slightly closer to catch her gaze. Jess, you're one of the brightest people I've ever met. And I'm not saying that out of nostalgia. I trust you. His words touched her deeply. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, Howard. That means a lot. A few days later, after hours of work, Howard surprised her with an unusual suggestion. I have something to show you, he said. No work, just something I think you'll like. He took her to a small planetarium in the city, a place he often visited to reconnect with his passion for space. The place was simple but enchanting. As the star projections lit up the ceiling, Howard turned to her. You were always the girl who believed in the stars, he said. And I guess I never lost that either. Even when life got complicated, looking at the sky reminded me that there's always something bigger. Jessica felt a wave of emotion at his words. It was as if they captured exactly what she felt but could never express. For the first time, she realized that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The project continued at a relentless pace, but the weight of responsibilities felt less overwhelming for Jessica now. Howard, with his light-hearted humor and laid-back approach, brought a different energy to the team. Despite the technical challenges testing everyone's limits, moments of levity began to emerge outside the workplace, adding new dimensions to their growing relationship. One afternoon, as they finalized the details of a simulation, one of their team members, David, an electrical engineer known for organizing casual get-togethers, entered the lab with a conspiratorial grin. All right, everyone, I'm hosting a dinner at my place tomorrow night, he announced. Nothing formal, just an excuse to unwind. You two are invited, and don't even think about backing out. Jessica glanced at Howard, her expression uncertain, while he simply smiled. Sounds like a good idea. What do you think, Jess? He asked. She hesitated. I'm not exactly the kind of person for parties. It's not a party, it's a dinner, David insisted, laughing. And everyone needs a break, even you, Dr. Turner. The next evening, Jessica arrived at David's home feeling a bit nervous. The house was warm and inviting, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with string lights in the backyard and the smell of barbecue wafting through the air. She spotted Howard chatting with a few colleagues near the grill, his easy laughter carrying across the yard. He saw her immediately and waved, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You made it," he said, approaching. "I was starting to think you'd back out." Jessica shrugged. "I needed to step out of my bubble." "You seem to be enjoying yourself." "It's easy when you have a beer and good stories," he replied, offering her a bottle of water. "But seriously, it's nice to see you outside the lab. It suits you." Jessica smiled, surprised by the compliment. Over the course of the evening, she began to relax, joining the conversations and even laughing at some of the work-related jokes she usually found tiresome. At one point, she and Howard found themselves away from the group, sitting on a bench in the backyard. "So, have you always been this social?" she asked, teasingly. "Not always," he admitted, gazing at the stars. "But I've learned to value moments like these. Life's tough enough as it is, you know?" Jessica nodded, feeling more connected to him than ever. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the sky. It was as though the universe itself was conspiring to bring them closer together. Back at work, the challenges didn't let up. During a critical simulation, an issue with the navigation system almost derailed the project's timeline. Jessica and Howard worked late into the night to fix the problem, the tension palpable. "We're so close," Jessica said, frustrated. "We can't let something this basic hold us back." Howard looked at her, trying to lighten the mood. "Hey, it's just another hurdle. If there's one thing you taught me, it's that no problem is too big to solve." She stared at him for a moment before a small smile broke through. "You have a strange way of making me feel like I can handle anything." "Maybe because you can," he replied, his sincerity disarming her. A few days later, Howard surprised her with an unusual suggestion. "I have something to show you," he said. "Nothing work-related, just something I think you'll like." He took her to a small planetarium in the city, a place he often visited to reconnect with his passion for space. The venue was simple but enchanting. As the stars were projected across the ceiling, Howard turned to her. "You've always been the girl who believed in the stars," he said. "And I guess I never lost that either. Even when life got complicated, looking at the sky reminded me that there's always something bigger out there." Jessica felt a wave of emotion at his words. It was as if he had captured exactly what she felt but had never been able to put into words. For the first time, she realized she might not be as alone as she had thought. The atmosphere in the lab was tense with anticipation. The next phase of the project would mark a turning point, an orbital test to evaluate the spacecraft's navigation and propulsion systems. Howard, with his experience as a test pilot and aerospace engineer, had been selected to lead the mission. The responsibility was immense, and everyone on the team felt its weight. Jessica was restless. Although she trusted Howard's abilities, the thought of sending him into space on a spacecraft still in the testing phase unsettled her. During the final meeting before the launch, she struggled to focus on the technical discussions. Her mind was consumed by hypothetical scenarios she couldn't shake. At the end of the meeting, as the team dispersed, Howard approached her. "You're awfully quiet," he said, trying to ease the tension. Jessica sighed. "I'm just worried. This is a test mission, Howard. Things can go wrong." "I know," he replied, his smile reassuring. "But you know as well as I do that we've done everything we can to make sure they won't." She searched his eyes for any sign of doubt but found only confidence. "I trust you," she finally said. "I just don't like not having control over this." "Welcome to my world," he quipped, eliciting a small smile from her. It worked. On the day of the launch, the control room buzzed with nervous energy. Screens displayed real-time images of the spacecraft and Howard's vital signs, while engineers and technicians conducted their final system checks. Jessica sat among them, her eyes fixed on the data streaming across her console. "Propulsion system ready," announced one of the technicians. "Communication stable," added another. Howard, already aboard the spacecraft, sounded calm over the comms. "This is Bennett. Everything's good on my end. Let's do this." Jessica clasped her hands in her lap, hiding her anxiety. She knew Howard was trying to keep morale high, but the thought that something could go wrong weighed heavily on her. As the rocket launched, the control room filled with coordinated voices managing operations. Jessica barely blinked, monitoring every detail of the ascent. Everything proceeded as planned, and the spacecraft entered orbit without incident. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, though Jessica remained tense. Howard began conducting the scheduled tests. The spacecraft responded well to the initial maneuvers, and all systems appeared stable. "Everything's performing perfectly," he reported. Moving on to the next test. Then, something unexpected happened. An alarm sounded, signaling a failure in the secondary propulsion system. The control room erupted in activity as engineers debated possible causes and solutions. "Howard, we're detecting a failure in Propulsion Unit 2, the mission director informed him. "Can you confirm?" "Copy that," Howard replied, his voice calm but serious. "Checking now." Jessica's stomach churned. A system failure wasn't part of the anticipated scenarios. She knew that if the problem wasn't resolved quickly, it could jeopardize the spacecraft's ability to re-enter the atmosphere safely. "Propulsion Unit 2 is non-operational," Howard reported. Attempting manual restart. The tension in the control room was palpable. Jessica leaned over her console, analyzing the data frantically. "He needs to reroute power to the primary propulsion system," she told the mission director. "But it has to be done with pinpoint accuracy. Otherwise, the spacecraft's stability could be compromised." "Bennett, we're sending instructions," the director said. Jessica barely breathed as she watched Howard execute the commands. His voice remained steady, but she knew he was under immense pressure. When the power redistribution was completed and the spacecraft stabilized, the control room erupted into applause. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. "Well done, Howard," the mission director said. "Test complete. Preparing for re-entry." "Understood," Howard replied, his tone carrying a hint of a smile. "I can't wait to get back and tell this story." Jessica couldn't help but smile. He was right, this would be a moment to remember. Hours later, when Howard safely returned, Jessica rushed to the landing area along with the rest of the team. When he emerged from the capsule, visibly exhausted but smiling, Jessica felt a wave of emotions she couldn't contain. "You gave me a scare," she said, approaching him. "But I got the job done," he replied with a tired smile. "And so did you." Before she could think, she hugged him. It was a spontaneous gesture, something she wouldn't have done under normal circumstances, but at that moment, it felt right. Howard returned the hug, holding her tightly. "Thanks for believing in me," he whispered. Jessica pulled back, smiling. "Always." The road to Maplewood felt different for Jessica, though she had traveled it countless times in her youth. There was something about Howard's presence beside her that made everything seem new, yet strangely familiar. It was as if the past and present were intertwining. Howard stared out the window as the rural scenery passed by. Green fields and white fences painted the view with a nostalgic touch. "It's funny," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I don't think I ever imagined coming back to Maplewood after so long, especially with you." Jessica smiled, her eyes on the road. "I don't think I did either. For years, I thought our promise was just something kids say, something time would erase. But here we are. And maybe the stars helped a little, don't you think?" he said, with a smile she recognized from decades ago. Jessica laughed. "Maybe more than we're willing to admit." They arrived at the Turner house in the late afternoon. The backyard was almost unchanged, as if time had forgotten that place. The old rope swing still hung from the tree, swaying gently in the breeze. Jessica paused for a moment, taking in the scene. It was like stepping back in time. Jessica's mother, a lively woman with gray hair tied in a bun, appeared at the door with a warm smile. "Jessica," she exclaimed, opening her arms for a hug. "And you brought company?" Howard stepped out of the car with a friendly smile. "Hi, Mrs. Turner. I'm Howard. Howard Bennett." Jessica's mother's eyes lit up. "Howard Bennett?" She looked at Jessica with an almost conspiratorial smile. "My goodness, you used to talk about him all the time when you were little. Howard this, Howard that. I feel like I already know you." Jessica blushed slightly but laughed. "Mom, please." Howard shrugged, feigning humility. "Well, it's nice to know I was famous in Maplewood." "Famous, indeed," Mrs. Turner said, ushering them inside. The house was as welcoming as Howard remembered. The walls were decorated with family photos and small framed quotes of inspiration. The smell of freshly baked apple pie filled the air. Conversation flowed naturally during dinner. They shared stories, laughed, and reminisced about childhood moments. While serving dessert, Jessica's mother looked at the two of them with a twinkle in her eyes. "You two were inseparable as kids. It's good to see life found a way to bring you back together." Jessica glanced at Howard, who responded with a smile. "I think some connections are hard to break," he said, his voice carrying genuine sincerity. After dinner, Jessica and Howard decided to step outside to the backyard. The sky was clear, filled with stars, and the soft sound of crickets filled the silence. Jessica sat on the rope swing, feeling like the 8-year-old girl who used to dream of the impossible. Howard stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the sky. "Do you remember how we used to make wishes on shooting stars?" she asked, breaking the silence. Howard smiled, nodding. "How could I forget? It's what brought us here." Jessica chuckled softly. "Do you really think that's what it was?" "Maybe," he replied, turning to look at her. "Or maybe it was destiny all along. But I like to think the stars had a hand in it." Suddenly, a shooting star streaked across the sky, bright and fleeting. Jessica and Howard sat silently, taking in the moment. It felt like something out of a dream, a sign that everything was exactly as it should be. "Are you going to make a wish?" Howard asked, turning to her. Jessica shook her head, a gentle smile lighting up her face. "I don't need to. I think I already have everything I wished for." Howard took a step closer, wrapping her in a warm embrace. Jessica let herself melt into the moment, feeling safe in his arms. "Then I guess it's my turn to thank the stars," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. They stayed there for a while, holding each other under the starlit sky, as if the universe itself had conspired once again to bring them together. Years had passed since Jessica and Howard's reunion. What began as a nostalgic reconnection soon evolved into something deeper, more meaningful. Not only had they rebuilt the bond they shared in childhood, but they had also created a life together, filled with challenges and triumphs. The space agency remained a central part of their lives. Jessica had become one of the leading scientific minds in the organization, while Howard balanced his career as a test pilot with his growing role in developing cutting-edge aerospace technologies. Working side by side, they found that they not only complemented each other's skills but also drew strength and inspiration from the partnership they had built. But it was the arrival of Hallie, their daughter, that brought a new kind of happiness into their lives. Her name, chosen in honor of Hallie's comet, served as a constant reminder of how the stars had played a pivotal role in their story. Hallie was a curious and enchanting child, with the same passion for the unknown that her parents shared. She grew up listening to stories of how her mother and father met and how the stars had guided them back to each other. On this particular night, they were back in Maplewood, at the house where it all began. The backyard was the same, with the rope swing still hanging from the old tree. Jessica and Howard had decided it was time to share this special place with Hallie, showing her where their own dreams had taken root. The backyard was quiet, except for the sound of crickets. Howard stood, holding Hallie on his shoulders, while Jessica watched them with a serene smile. The sky was clear and full of stars, each one shining like a promise of something greater. "Look, Daddy!" Hallie exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. "A shooting star!" Howard and Jessica both looked up at the same time, seeing the bright trail streaking across the sky. For a moment, they were transported back in time, remembering the night they had made their own wishes under a sky just like this one. Howard turned to Jessica, and she met his gaze with a smile that said more than words ever could. He then looked up at Hallie, still perched on his shoulders. "Make a wish," he said, his voice soft yet purposeful, as if he wanted the words to stay with her forever. Hallie squeezed her eyes shut, murmuring something quietly to herself. Neither Jessica nor Howard could hear what she wished for, but they both knew it didn't matter. The moment was perfect as it was. When she opened her eyes again, Howard held her securely, as though trying to make the moment last forever. Jessica placed her hand on his shoulder, and the three of them stood in silence, gazing up at the stars. The promise Howard and Jessica had made years ago, under the same stars, was not just an echo of the past. It was a reminder that true connections withstand time, hardships, and change. And now, with Hallie, that promise took on a new meaning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.